Being said, I'm gonna turn the floor over to Mr. Jerry Wooten.
Oh, no, that's fine.
I'm gonna move this back. Somebody's the happiest one in the room back there tonight. I'm gonna use the mic, because it's the end of my day and sometimes my voice gets a little stressed, so. Can y'all hear me now? Good.
Yes, sir.
All right, well, first and foremost, thank you all so much for inviting me to come speak with you tonight. Before I forget, I want to thank the cooks. That meal, those chicken and dumplings were some of the best I've ever had, so thank you so much. Y'all got a good deal going here with these ladies and their food. Thank you. And that chili too, that gets a star as well. Mr. McCommon, thank you so much for the invite. I'm sorry it's taken a little bit to get me here. Fall in Tennessee State Parks, there's a lot going on, so I figured let's try to do it in the winter.
Our honor. There's one thing about this, you gotta take Bobby home with you.
Things can be arranged miraculously sometimes. But no, it's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I hope some of the information I share with you, you'll learn something. I've got, just to give you a little bit of a background, I actually started my career here at Shiloh Park when I was in college. I was a seasonal park ranger, worked here back in the 90s for 3 years, and then moved on around the country and worked at various other parks. And that eventually led me to Tennessee State Parks, where I'm now a manager. Prior to my tenure at Paris Landing State Park as manager, I served for 7 years as manager of this place, which is the title of the program tonight, Johnsonville. Just a show of hands, has anybody been to Johnsonville? Okay, so there's a few of you. Hopefully those of you that have, and even those that have not, I can share some things about this miraculous story with you all tonight that probably will bring some familiarity, but was able to, when I wrote this book, finally got it out just in time for COVID in December of 2019. So had lots of plans to go around and tour on the book. That has been happening since about 2021 now, but about a year and a half. The timing was just perfect. But this is basically the outcome of my PhD dissertation. I went to Middle Tennessee State University, where I majored in American history with an emphasis in resource management and the Civil War. I had an advantage of being at Johnsonville as manager during that time. So I was actually living just like this, if you were at Shiloh, living on site, being on the battlefield, being at that location. And I was just amazed that there had never been a major book or any, there've been publications through Confederate Veteran Magazine, Civil War Times. There's all sorts of periodicals that have been written about Johnsonville from the early 1900s. But there'd never been a major book. And I just thought, okay, there's, being a PhD student, you have to have an original research subject. And being a history student and with a very strong interest in Civil War, I basically grew up just outside of Dover, Tennessee. So Fort Donelson was like my backyard. I have lineage on both sides of the war. I have a Confederate veteran that served on my mother's side in the 49th Tennessee that was surrendered at Fort Donelson. They went on to Camp Douglas, and of course, at that time of the war, if you recall, the prisoner exchange was still going on. And then my father's ancestor was Yankee, and his ancestor served in the 5th Ohio Cavalry, that ironically was at Johnsonville. I didn't know that until I started digging into that. So I have strong Civil War lineage on both sides. So born and raised in Tennessee, I'm very honored to be going around my own state to groups just like y'all, talking and expressing the importance of the story. Johnsonville dominated the headlines in newspapers when this took place in 1864, just like Fort Pillow. So that was on the minds of everybody in the North. And keep in mind, in November of 1864, the Confederacy is losing the war, and they're losing badly. Then all of a sudden, this gentleman right over here, Nathan Bedford Forrest, pops up on the Tennessee River suddenly and wins a strategic victory. tactical victory right on the banks of the Tennessee River. And the war would be over 6 months after the Battle of Johnsonville. What happens, of course, a lot of this history got lost because just on the very day that Johnsonville was closed after the battle is the same day, November the 30th, that the bloody Battle of Franklin was unfolded. So that bloodbath that takes place at Franklin sort of overshadows the events that took place here at Johnsonville. So tonight I'm going to hopefully share a little bit of that story with you. Just very quickly, I'll just sort of tell you what I was after when I was writing this book. I wanted to know, what did the place look like? It was a Union supply depot. It was built strictly to supply the Army of the Cumberland, and eventually those supplies would go down and hook up with General Sherman. And most of those supplies that came into Johnsonville were supplying Sherman's army as he was now moving through Georgia. What was not happening, of course, is that the popularity of Humphreys County, which was 99% Confederate, I've tried to find McNairy's one of those, Hardin County's one of those, some of the Weakley County was one of those. They were almost 100% Confederate. And you get into Middle Tennessee, Davidson County, those areas, they were split, and especially when you get to East Tennessee, it was almost primarily Union Federal. But where they carved out Johnsonville was right dead smack in the heart of Confederate territory. And I use this comparison a lot, but those of you who know Fort Campbell, I'm from that area up there. There's a lot going on in the military base all the time, but my mother was a secretary at Fort Campbell. She would drive from Stewart County there every day. And it just kind of made me think that when the Federal Army came into Johnsonville and carved out this 90-acre supply depot, the community that was living there had ancestors, had relatives in the Civil War. They were in the Confederate Army. So you had a spy network that was going on. You had all these civilians that were coming into the Union Federal Depot working for this quartermaster's department that were distributing all these supplies to the Federal troops. So I think it's very, it's not just ironic, but we had the same thing, 80 years later that takes place with the formation of Camp Campbell in the late 1930s, early 40s, where you had a federal military base, and it's being supported by all the civilians that live on the outside counties. So the same thing is happening 80 years later after the war. And I kind of get into that into the book, but there was a lot of questions that I wanted to ask myself. There's very few photographic documentation of the Western Theater, as y'all know. Johnsonville is one of those rare exceptions where there were 5 existing Civil War photographs that we know of that survived the war that showed Johnsonville in its fullness. It's taken about 3 weeks after the battle. At the very end of the slide program, if we got enough time, I've got those images. I'll be glad to show you. There were a lot of questions I asked myself about, what did it look like on the inside? Why was this so important for the Confederates to gain? You have to remember, Middle Tennessee, the railroads in Middle Tennessee were cross-sectioned and controlled strictly by the Union Army at that time. So there was one offshoot of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad that went west to this area called Johnsonville. And let me get I'm just going to give you all just a basic background of what this is. So Johnsonville, it was basically a quick fix for a major problem late in the Civil War that began in August of 1863. It did end up being the largest Union supply depot on the Tennessee River. A lot of people thought it was Chattanooga, but that was formed a lot later, and they didn't utilize it like they had planned because they moved on into Georgia. This operated for it was in operation for about 9 months until November the 4th, which you're about to hear about. There's Humphreys County. Most of you know where it is. Humphreys County has the second hump. I always say that. Let's see, here's Stewart County, where I'm from, has the hump, and then you got another little leg hump right there. Where that little bow is in Humphreys County is where Johnsonville is located. Named after this guy right here, Andrew Johnson, who became the vice president under Lincoln. He was a loyal Democrat, out of everything that was going on in East Tennessee, he stayed loyal to the Union. So Lincoln appointed him as a military governor of Tennessee. That had only been tried one other time in Louisiana and North Carolina, which had failed. Lincoln immediately, upon the fall of Nashville on February the 25th, 1862, right after Fort Donelson, tries it one more time by placing this military governor. And with the title of being a military governor came the rank of a brigadier general. So without any military experience whatsoever, Andrew Johnson, who later becomes our vice president, is given a military rank with no experience whatsoever in leading troops in the field or no military training as a brigadier general. Keep in mind though, even though he had the rank of a brigadier general, Major General Rosecrans was still his superior. So Rosecrans, I've tried to wrap my head about that. Imagine that today. You got Bill Lee is the governor of our state, but since there was a war going on, Johnson was still taking orders from Major General Rosecrans, who outranked him. But anyway, they realized very quickly on that there was a drought that summer of 1862. The Cumberland River was very low. They didn't know if they could get these deep draft supply vessels to use Nashville as a supply base, so they decided to move further west, 78 miles, right out of downtown Nashville, to a place called an existing riverboat landing called Lucas Landing. And to connect Nashville with the Tennessee River, they decided to build a military railroad. So you got a military governor that now gets federal funds together, and this came directly from the War Department and the United States Quartermaster's Department. There's actually a whole other program that I give just about the railroad, but we're not going to focus on that tonight because we're going to do the battle. So they end up making the terminus of this Nashville and Northwestern Railroad at an existing steamboat landing known as Lucas Landing. So look at what we got in Tennessee. I'll go backwards. You got Pittsburgh Landing. You're going up the river, there's Mousetail Landing, there's a state park named after it. We've got Paris Landing where I work. In between there, you got Lucas Landing, Cuba Landing. If you're on I-40, you see that sign of Cuba. All these landings pre-existed the Civil War. These were flatboat, very early landings, which was the commerce system of Tennessee prior to the railroad being constructed. So that's how they got supplies into these very rural areas. So all these landings were pre-existing long before the Civil War, so most of them 30, 40 years. Lucas Landing was constructed about 1828 to 1830. We know that. Miraculously, when I was doing my research, was spending a lot of time in the state library, came across this photo, unpublished, never seen it. This shows Lucas Landing, which is just amazing. What you're looking at here is the unflooded Tennessee River. Here's the western riverbank where General Forrest and his troops would attack Johnsonville. It was 380 yards across, very similar to the Tennessee River here at Pittsburgh Landing. So if you can go down to Pittsburgh Landing and look at the width on the other side, that's what you would have seen there with an unflooded TVA reservoir as we have today. I'm at Paris Landing, and the Kentucky Lake, officially known as the Kentucky Reservoir, that was formed in 1944. Prior to that, before they dammed the rivers, you had a Tennessee River that was about 300 to 380 yards wide, so about 3 Titans football fields. So that was, I think, this is a Civil War era building. It's still hugging the bank. The only thing I know about this is that it was taken in 1902. And just to the left of here are the guts of a Civil War federal transport boat that I actually have in the book. I don't know if I got a slide. So when they carved this place called Johnsonville out, what they ended up with was this 90-acre perimeter. And they fortified it because you got a lower fort, you got an upper fort. Both of these combined together were called Fort Johnson, named after the governor himself. And here's the railroad as it came in. It terminated at the riverfront, where they would load supplies from 2 major transfer warehouses. So all this operation was going on. All these supplies were being sent to Nashville on trains. You had major Confederate guerrilla activity in this area from Charlotte, Clarksville area, southern Montgomery County, especially Dixon County today. A lot of raiding going on this particular railroad. So that's one of the reasons today, if you're familiar with a town right outside of Dixon called Tennessee City, that was Camp Mussey, M-U-S-S-E-Y, that was the stationary camp for United States colored troops that were responsible mainly for building this railroad. But they were being attacked religiously, constantly, day in and day in and day out with these supply trains going to Nashville. So, of course, this information is going to eventually get to Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, here's just a cross-section of the two forts. By the way, if you haven't been there, it's some of the most amazingly preserved earthworks in the state of Tennessee. Now, the earthworks at Triune, if y'all have seen those, they're wonderfully preserved. These have been, I've got a slide at the very end of this, they've just been sitting up in these woods for almost 160 years. Didn't we just do the 150th anniversary? I can't believe it's the 160th already.
160.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 160 years, these earthworks have just been sitting there on top of the hill, and they look just like this. The upper redoubt is just in immaculate shape. And at the end of it, my friend David Meager, the artist, good friend of mine who lives in Alabama, he did all these bird's eye view sketches. He was trained as a Marine artist. And he's a Civil War historian. And so he took those existing photos I told you about and compiled what he thought Johnsonville probably looked like. So this is just an artist depiction. I know it's kind of hard to see, but it had a substantial riverfront. It was about 600 yards long. Here's transfer warehouse number 1, which was a single roof warehouse, and then there was this massive double roof warehouse on the opposite side, on the southern end. Here's the railroad as it comes in today. When you visit the park, you actually enter right down beside that on that road. The roundhouse is still there. These were all the civilian buildings where you had civilian workers that were talked about that were from the surrounding town. These were administrative buildings for the quartermaster's department. So all of this is where supplies would be shipped down from places like Cincinnati, Ohio, that would eventually make their way to Louisville, Kentucky, that would eventually make their way to Cairo, Illinois, and then to Paducah. And then from Paducah, they would be distributed out from there onto various transport boats. And I'll get into that in a little bit tonight, but there's a big difference between tinclads, ironclads, and transports. And I'll explain that in just a minute. All right, so with that kind of gives you a real basic rundown of why Johnsonville is there, what they're doing, and why this becomes a focal point for the presentation tonight. So this is Forrest's fourth campaign, fourth adventure into West Tennessee. He had 2 in 1862, another one early in 1864 that resulted in him going into Western Kentucky, which is why in March of that year, 1864, the Battle of Paducah takes place. Forrest makes his way back, eventually if you follow his campaign, Forrest's Cavalry Corps is actually formed in May of that year, May of 1864. And he's just coming off his very successful Alabama campaign, the Battle of Athens. So they find themselves at the beginning of this fourth campaign right here in Corinth, Mississippi. So when this campaign takes off, he has basically under his command almost about 3,000 troopers. And most of these have been infantry. Most of them are mounted, a lot of them on mules. One of those excursions into Western Kentucky was actually to secure more mounts for this campaign, which was successful, by the way. There's the man. I think that's one of the photos. Yep, there's probably more Forrest historians in here than I've ever collected in any presentation I've ever done. But I love Nathan Bedford Forrest. I've spent a good part of my historical career studying the man, and I believe this is the photograph that was taken in early 1864. You've seen his last one where he becomes a lieutenant general. He looked very weathered. It was taken in February of 1865. That's this image right here, which is one of the more famous ones. And in that actual photo, he's a lieutenant general at that point. Okay, so here's basically the plan. In October, Forrest informs his superior, Lieutenant Richard Taylor, This is right out of the OR. It's my present design to take possession of Fort Hyman on the Tennessee River below Johnsonville and thus prevent communication with Johnsonville by transports. You're going to see that term used a lot in Civil War history. You know, when they're talking river, nautical language, when they say below Johnsonville, that's north. Because the rivers, if you know, they all flow north. So anything below Johnsonville is going to be Fort Hyman, Paris Landing, Paducah, north. Okay, so this is what he's referring to. And then here's part of, I'm going to take this out. I'm breaking my neck. Oh, yeah, that's better. Or maybe not. There's his plan. So Forrest's orders, you can see there from Taylor, is sever General Sherman's communications, delay George Thomas at Nashville from concentrating troops and supplies, and then assist John Bell Hood's advance in the Middle Tennessee. All this is coming together in late October, early November, as Hood was making plans at that point, moving back into Tennessee when he crossed the Tennessee River. Okay, for this campaign, and I got here today, and I always like to go visit General Chalmers' markers. When I was a ranger here, I gave a program of General Chalmers' push on the Deal Branch, which I still think today is probably some of the hardest terrain in the American Civil War. I think all of you would attest to that, considering, as the crow flies, is what, Larry, about a mile from here? And but General Chalmers, at this time, for this campaign, is the 1st Division commander of Forrest's Cavalry. They're at that point, they're in the area of Memphis. They're operating in and around outside the skirts of Memphis. They're going to get orders to rally with General Forrest to head to the Tennessee River to meet up at Jackson, Tennessee, at a place called Jack's Creek. There's a sign there today. If you drive up there, you'll see it on the side of 45. Some of Chalmers' division brigade commanders are Colonel Thomas Mabry and Colonel Robert McCulloch. Also, Chalmers' division, formerly of General Abraham Buford's division, is the famed Colonel Edmund Rucker, Alabamian, and Lieutenant David Kelly. His second in command of the 2nd Division is General Abraham Buford. Buford's a very interesting character. If you've seen the movie Gettysburg, you know John Buford, first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, that's his first cousin. He also had another first cousin, Napoleon Buford. You know, these are all, keep in mind, they're all Kentucky fine horse breeders. That family is. The Buford family is still that in Kentucky today. But Napoleon Buford is also becomes a major general, and he's in charge of the Department of Arkansas. So his 2 first cousins are Union generals, and Abraham Buford, who is, of course, you know, he's a West Point graduate. He joined the Dragoons in the Mexican War, fights in the Mormon Wars, fights in the Seminole Wars, has quite a military career. He's one of my favorite generals. Also struck quite an appearance. He, from everything I've read, he weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 320 to 30 pounds. So he was. If you look at Confederate generals engraved, you have that collection. He was one of the largest Confederate generals ever that took part in the saddle. But he was a very dominating figure, and his men loved him. He's one of my favorite commanders. But Buford's ordered to move from Corinth on a direct route to Lexington, Tennessee, and then from Lexington, Tennessee, eventually through Paris, and eventually to the Tennessee River, where he gets to Paris Landing on the October the 28th. So some of the division commanders with him are Highland Lion. One of my favorites, Tyree Bell. Y'all read this book right here? If you haven't, I recommend it highly. It's a fantastic read. Tyree Bell's a very interesting character. Going into the Johnsonville campaign, he and Rucker had battlefield commissions to become a brigadier general that would take place shortly after the Johnsonville campaign. Then, of course, there's John W. Morton, Forrest's young 24-year-old chief of artillery. Morton leaves a fantastic account. Most of you may have read it. If you haven't, I highly suggest it. It's the artillery of General Nathan Bedford Forrest's artillery. And he gives a very, very sharp depiction of the engagement that takes place at Johnsonville. Actually, some of the direct quotes that I used in my book came directly from that source. And he was very, very confident, very trusting, Forrest was, in his chief of artillery. And from my research, I basically claimed that Morton was one of the reasons I think that they ended up where they did. We'll get into this in a minute, but General Forrest in early November of 1864, he was sick. And there was a couple of accounts that, one of them specifically that found General Forrest sitting under a tree with a blanket over him coughing. And I talked to Jack Hurst, his biographer, about this, and he also agreed. He thought that Forrest probably went into this campaign very ill, which is one of the reasons why, if you know the story, he had asked permission from Taylor for a leave of absence so he could heal, and it was denied because Taylor told him that our actions and activities in West Tennessee were too far important. And being the general and the man that he was, he stepped up to the duty, and that's one of the reasons why this campaign continued moving forward. But he put a lot of faith and direction in his two very experienced division leaders at that time, and especially in his chief of artillery. As they go into this campaign, Forrest has with him about 3,000 men. He's going to be eventually attacking a base at Johnsonville that has a force late in the war where you actually have a federal force that's less than what the Confederates have. They're going to have about 2,800 men in and around, combined with Navy personnel and Army personnel inside of Johnsonville. So here's just a depiction of what goes on. And keep in mind, I know there's a lot of information to follow here. This is a very convoluted campaign, but it's happening basically. They're leaving Jackson, heading to the Tennessee River around mid-October. They rally some for a little while in Macklemoresville and Paris the week of the 20th. And they all find themselves rallying at the Tennessee River where the Big Sandy comes into the Tennessee River at Paris Landing, where I work, and also at the actual Paris Landing itself. So on the 28th, Beaver's division reaches the mouth of the Big Sandy River. At Paris Landing, Beaver divides his division, leaving Bell's brigade and two sections of Morton's and Walton's batteries at two locations. So this is part of Taylor's orders for Forrest to disrupt traffic on the Tennessee River. And the traffic that he's talking about was this transport traffic carrying supplies to Johnsonville. So Forrest knew that if he could intercept these transport boats, that would stop the constant flow of supplies that eventually would end up in Nashville and eventually end up in Georgia for General Sherman's move. Also, another section of Joseph Mason's battery was positioned just north of Paris Landing, and another section under Trantham was positioned 1,000 yards near the Big Sandy River. So this is Paris Landing today. Here's the bridge crossing the Kentucky Lake. There's the marina that we have. I think the original Paris Landing, and here's the original, see that line? This is the channel. Here's the flooded waters that make Kentucky Lake. Right in that bend, right where the bridge crosses, is where I think the original Paris Landing was located. So they would have had artillery here, and here's where Big Sandy flows right into the Tennessee. And it would have flowed somewhere right in here. So right at that apex, they would have had these other batteries. The 1,000 yards, you can pretty much, that is about 1,000 yards. I'm here every day, and I've stood there a lot, and I've looked at that distance. So I think that those, of course, all this is under the lake today, where these positions would have been located, but that's a pretty good depiction of that. So Confederate occupation of Fort Hyman. Part of this is that Forrest sends Buford north with Morton to occupy the former Confederate fort of Fort Hyman. Has anybody ever been up there? It's a unit of the National Park Service today. It's owned by the Fort Donelson National Battlefield. They acquired it, I think, 2007. But it's just a wonderfully preserved Confederate-built fort. There's also a federal fort that was built further up on top of the hill from there. But all of this has been abandoned at this stage in the war. There's nobody in there. So Forrest knows this through his scouting, these various scouting parties that have been up in around that area of western Kentucky. So he sends these guys up there to plant artillery, camouflage artillery on the low bank below Fort Hyman to try to intercept this federal gunboat and transport traffic. There's a picture I took of those works, just beautiful. And these are Confederate works. These are Confederate, just like Fort Donelson, Confederate-made works. So I do know that the Federals later on added some. I wish there was a way to stop that squeaking. I think I'm just done for at that point. Maybe the volume's turned up a little much. I'll try to step back a little more. But if you can see right there, that's what it looks like if you were to go there today. This, unfortunately, right here is a house that someone's built right on the edge of the ditch. This is just another kind of a better study that shows you the Tennessee River Channel. Fort Hyman's right here. Fort Henry was there. And early in the war, Fort Henry, which is the anniversary is coming up next Tuesday, by the way, February the 6th, is flooded by the time that surrender takes place. So it's almost directly across from Fort Henry, just to kind of give you an idea. And this area right here, where the bridge is where Paris Landing is today. Okay. So these actions that take place first at Fort Hyman happened on the 29th. On Saturday the 29th, a federal transport boat called the Mazeppa. And keep in mind, a lot of this story is about naval history. So what you had in the especially late in the Civil War, it took the Brown Water Navy, which was the Western Squadron, which was based out of Cairo, Illinois, and eventually Paducah. It took a long time for the United States Navy to really learn how to fight warfare on the inland rivers. So what you had these transport boats. I'll give you an idea. If you've been to Nashville and you've seen the General Jackson showboat, picture that in your head, and that was the size of some of these transport boats. They're huge, massive stern-wheel boats that were privately owned by civilians that the United States Navy leases from these civilians for military use. So the Mazeppa is one of those boats. It's on its maiden voyage from Cincinnati, Ohio. It's filled, packed with supplies, and it's heading to Johnsonville. So as it rounds the corner at Fort Hyman and Fort Henry, Confederates fire on the Mazeppa. There's some wonderful accounts that I included in the book. One of the Confederate shots using one of the 14-pound Rodman guns that were captured at Union City, in Alabama, is actually one of the guns that fires and cuts the stovepipe of the Mazeppa right in half. And they immediately start firing on this transport boat. And keep in mind, the transport boats, the only way to defend themselves are just men with small arms on board. So the captain immediately sends the boat to the eastern shore and beaches it into a sandbar. So you got these, if you can kind of picture this in your head, you got these Confederates that are firing on these boats that look like this. And I showed this picture because it shows what a Civil War era barge is. I lived in Paducah for a little while, which is the hub of the inland river towing industry. I worked a little bit for Midland Corporation when I was had just left college. And you know how towboats operate today. You've got the towboat that pushes the barges out front. You see them plying the river all the time. Well, in the Civil War, you had when you hear of a barge was tied on the side of the boat. So if you look right here, there's one right there that's in tow. You would have had the boat that's heading upriver, and the barge would have been lashed to the side so it wouldn't get in the way of the stern wheel that's turning in the rear of the boat. You following me? So on the side of this would have just been packed with supplies: molasses, whiskey, hardtack, clothing, gunpowder, everything that an army needs to move. All those supplies would have been in this barge. So the Mazeppa is coming upriver, towing, and a Civil War terminology of towing means it's basically lashed to its side, towing a barge full of these supplies. And then this is just some of the action that takes place. So the Confederates open fire, this is just kind of the bullet points, on the Mazeppa. They cripple her within minutes. Mazeppa, as I mentioned, plows into a sandbar. The crew abandons ship, and they head over to the federal Fort Donelson, make their way 12 miles over what is today Land Between the Lakes, and they end up at Fort Donelson. Lyon's brigade, by the use of a howitzer, basically they find a big oak tree, and from the accounts that I read, and some of these accounts are directly from the participants that were put in Confederate Veteran magazine in the 1890s, and these guys are still alive. And one of them in Lyon's brigade said that we made a check post out of an oak tree and attached this howitzer to it. And because you got to think, this is probably a 290 to 300 ton vessel, and the entire 8th Kentucky with Buford himself. And there's some comical scenarios about that. That they got the howitzer, the guys swam across the river, attached the tow rope to the boat, and then they're hauling this Mazeppa transport boat back across to the western river shore of the Tennessee River. So the federal, while they're doing all that, and they're offloading supplies at Moody's Landing, and Moody's Landing is just below Fort Hyman. So any of you boaters that are out here, if you know where Paris Landing, where I work, if you just go north toward Kentucky, any of you fish, and you've seen Fort Hyman from the water, if you'll go just right below the fort that you can see on the hill, that would have been Moody's Landing. And of course, it's under the lake today, but that's the vicinity of where they were located. So while they're unloading all these supplies that they're planning to use for themselves to help with this campaign, 2 federal gunboats appear around the corner that are just en route to Johnsonville. They come around, appearing from the north, and commit shelling the Confederates. Walton's battery, who has the 20-pound Parrots, return fire, forcing the gunboats to withdraw back downriver. Fearing that the Mazeppa is going to be recaptured, Abraham Buford orders her to be set afire on the bank of the shoreline. The 3rd Kentucky is a great story about that, about who actually burned it. There's many accounts in Confederate Veteran that I read about. This went on for months, about who actually got the glory of burning the Mazeppa. This is one of David's maps that show the attack. You can see, this is the flooded waters today of the lake. Here's the river. Here's the route of the Mazeppa. So these concealed batteries fire and force her to the bank. Then down here, just below Fort Hyman, they put the rope and then they haul her back over. It's a great depiction I found that's in the Fort Donelson Visitor Center that shows Moody's Landing. It shows transport boats. I don't know if that's the Mazeppa. I'm really not understanding what he's depicting right here, but it is supposed to be during this campaign. What's very interesting is in the background back here is the flooded Fort Henry that he painted in there. This does give you some depiction. Fort Hyman is on a really steep bank of the Tennessee River. Beautiful view from there today. So while all that's going on, there's other actions that take place the next day on the Tennessee River at Paris Landing. So you got to follow me very, very closely here. So you've got the Mazeppa. I wish there was a way to. Is there a way to turn that down a little bit? It's just.
I'll try. I don't know.
I hate that y'all are getting all the feedback from this. So this.
Anybody know anything about it?
Maybe just the volume.
Unplug it.
Turn it.
There we go. All right, that made it. So now we're going to head back down the Paris Landing. There's another federal transport boat that's heading north, towing a barge, just like the one Mazeppa that was heading south, known as the Anna. It's spotted by these Confederate batteries at Paris Landing. By this time, Chalmers has arrived. He outlines the shoreline at Paris Landing with infantry, and he's got his artillery in place. They see this boat coming up, and they summon her over to the shoreline. Well, the pilot, did not know at the time that there may have been a Confederate trap on the Tennessee River with Confederates trying to basically capture or do some sort of bad stuff on federal transport boats. So while they're trying to summon the Anna over to the western shore, the Paris Landing shores, she gets right up to the bank, and the Confederates immediately start firing on this boat. Well, the Anna is one of the reasons why Forrest is actually found out about from the Western gunboat flotilla that's in Paducah, Kentucky. The Anna actually escapes the Confederate batteries and eventually makes its way to safety back to Paducah to alert the Federal Western Fleet there that, hey, Forrest is down about somewhere around old Confederate Fort Hyman wreaking havoc on these Federal gunboats. So what that does, that changes the whole outlook of the campaign at Johnsonville, is that Leroy Fitch, who's the commander of that flotilla in Paducah, he orders 6 gunboats en route to see what's going on down around the Paris Landing, Fort Hyman area. Had the Anna not escaped, would have been a very long time before the Federals found out about this, much less an entire 6 boats of the Western Fleet be released down to see what's happening. So the Confederate artillery position north of Paris Landing commences fire, causing serious damage, but she does escape and makes her way back to Paducah. Now, here's my office today. Here's the marina, if you've been to Paris Landing. Here's the lake. Here's the bridge. So right here is where I was telling where I think the Paris Landing in the Civil War was located. Fort Henry's right here. That little tip that you see right there is right around that bend is Fort Hyman. So Sergeant Lemuel Zaring's guns under Morton's section would have been placed right here. They would have been in a lot of action with all of this that's happening, but I do know that's probably where Zaring's section is located. So, a lot happening here with the Confederate Navy tonight, by the way. So, you're going to learn about that in a second. So, this other boat, which is one of Johnsonville's gunboats, and as I mentioned earlier, there's various differentiations of boats, armed boats in the Civil War. These boats are called tin clads. And a tin clad was basically, if you can picture a soda can, that's about the width of armament that would have been just basically a piece of sheet tin that's hammered on the side, because these have been packet boats, transport boats, leisure boats prior to the Civil War that were just converted to Navy use. They took some of the cabin windows and they made gun ports out of those. So on one side of one of these tin clads, the Navy would have added these big, huge 24-inch Dahlgren Seacoast artillery pieces that were on carriages that would retract. And I've got a photo of all of these coming up. So one of these gunboats is the Undine that's actually assigned to Johnsonville. Keep in mind, all this traffic is going on between a 40-mile radius between Paris Landing, Tennessee, and Johnsonville, Tennessee. That's 40 nautical miles. So you got all this action taking place, and the Confederates are there trying to stop all of it. So as the Undine approaches Paris Landing, Confederates, once again, just like the Anna, they open fire. The Undine responds with these big 24-pound cannon. A furious battle. I couldn't believe in some of these accounts that I was reading from the Confederate accounts between Bell's brigade and the Undine. Just it's pretty crazy. Brown's artillery is also involved. The Undine eventually gets overpowered and they retreat just like the Mazeppa to the eastern bank. Her boiler gets damaged during this fight. And also in the Civil War, you're still a lot of, the rudders are being operated by what's called a tiller rope. Tiller ropes were used in Egyptian times. But the tiller rope that is basically operating the rudder, it gets cut during this battle. So she can't steer the vessel. So somehow it ends up on the eastern bank, and again, it beaches into a small sandbar. The crew abandons the boat. The Confederates basically now have possession of a gunboat. In all my research, I could not find any image. I mean, I called the Norfolk Maritime Museum, I called the U.S. Naval Academy. I really dug into this. Nobody could find, maybe somebody in the room has it, but no one could find an image of the USS Undine, gunboat number 55. Her sister ship, number 54, is right here. Her sister ship, meaning it was built on the same design. So we think this is what the Undine looked like. So here you can see civilian packet boat, and here are the gun ports right here. So it was a civilian steamer converted to military use. So all said, there's a number of actions that we don't have time to go into tonight, but here's some of the vessels that are seized by forces troops just in those 2 days and right before Halloween in 1864. The Mazeppa, the Venus, the Undine, and the J.W. Cheeseman, which was the largest one, is a 215-ton stern wheel transport. The Confederates burned this boat on the 31st because forced out of the Undine and the Venus that are captured, they were going to try to reconvert the J.W. Cheeseman. They realized that it was too far beyond repair, so they burned it right at the apex, right where the Big Sandy comes into the Tennessee River. There's a sandbar out there. It's called White Oak Island. I've been out there on both. In 1978, mussel divers went down onto that wreck. It's in the middle of the Tennessee River. It's in about 25 to 30 feet of water. We have the capstan. We have a number of artifacts that came to Johnsonville as donations off of that wreck. And I often tell audiences too, when I'm giving this presentation, I was amazed that the 240 nautical miles between Paducah and Muscle Shoals, Alabama, is the largest collection of Civil War inland river boat wrecks in the United States. So there's some identified. We think there's 67 to 70 boat wrecks between Paducah, Kentucky, and Muscle Shoals. 4 of those are at Johnsonville that you're about to see. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to tell. So the Anna was the other one, which escaped. They're the ones that alert the Federals. So on November the 1st, forces combined force after spending Halloween Day repairing these boats, loading their infantry troops on the boats to see who they could get on there. And amazingly, I'd love to see this scene, but Morton talks about even the men who were mounted taking their mounts on the boat. So you got these Confederate soldiers that use these captured Federal gunboats and transport boats. They load up with the idea that they're going to use these captured vessels to sail their way to Johnsonville, accompanied by a land force under General Chalmers and some of Buford's men, some of the infantrymen, and Morton. Morton could not, he had to carry his guns. They had to pull their guns. And unfortunately for him, it was some of the worst rain that these Confederates talked about in the entire Civil War. On November the 1st, right about when they leave, the skies turned gray and it just unleashed. It didn't stop raining for 4 days. Right as the Battle of Johnsonville is happening on November the 4th, the rain suddenly stopped. Some of the worst conditions the Confederates ever experienced in the Western Theater, I read many accounts that I put in the book about the conditions along the banks of the Tennessee River. So real quick, here's what they're going to go up against. The Federal forces at Johnsonville, under the command of this guy. It's the same story. If you've seen that movie Glory, Robert Gould Shaw, the white young officer who gets a political appointment due to his father, and he becomes in charge of a colonel of an African-American regiment. Same thing happens right here. This guy is from Bath, Maine, 24 years old, and he's given command of the 12th United States Colored Troops. So the garrison at Johnsonville is only about 2,200 men. And I wasn't even sure about that. Well, I do know that there was a garrison there of 800 soldiers, infantry, from the 43rd Wisconsin. These other people, I never could determine if they were permanently stationed there or they were just coming in and out. I think most of them, because their primary responsibility was to guard that Federal Railroad. So they weren't always at Johnsonville. So on the day the battle takes place, I do know that's the Federal total force, but I think on that day alone, It was just the 43rd Wisconsin with some scattered USCT troops. Another anomaly that takes place here is that for the first time in the war that I was able to find is that you've got armed United States quartermaster's troops. This is used successfully at Johnsonville so well when the battle happens that the quartermaster in Nashville, the Nashville Depot, when Hood is attacking Nashville, arms the same people again, arms members, civilians. They're all civilians, gives them a weapon. And those photos that you see, there's 4 that were taken of the Battle of Nashville, going up to Fort Negley. All those entrenchments, some of those civilians with weapons would have been used in those entrenchments while the soldiers would have been out front. And then here you've got, as I mentioned before I started, I said Johnsonville is a convoluted mess. You've got inside this 90-acre depot, you've got military combined with Army soldiers, and you've got Navy personnel. How do you think those guys got along? So this guy right here is in charge of the Navy. He's also the commandant of the USS Key West, which is one of the 4 gunboats. And he's the ranking officer, acting volunteer Lieutenant Edward King. He's the ranking senior naval officer at Johnsonville. So you got these 2 men that are in charge of the Federals at Johnsonville who hate each other's guts. And I prove that in the book too. If you get a copy of it, you'll read about it. Here's some of the Navy personnel. So those 10 clads are the USS Tarawa, the USS Key West, USS Elephant, and the USS Undine. And you can see all the Federal gunboats had a number. That's their number. You can see there was only one side wheeler, which was one of the smaller boats, which was the USS Tarawa. I think approximately there was 400 sailors and officers, just from my research, that were there that day, somewhere along the 600-yard wharf around the boats, and approximately 20 civilian transport boats and barges. All right, like I said, David is a naval artist. These are his side sketches of those boats. You can see the side wheeler Tarawa, the USS Undine, Elephant, and the Key West. And by the way, here at Shiloh, we had the Lexington and Tyler that really did quite a shellacking that night on the Confederates, keeping them asleep down in Deal Branch. The Lexington and Tyler would have been very similar to the USS Elephant and the USS Key West. They were also those tin-clad boats. I won't go into this a lot, but one of the bases of my book was I came across the letters of this gentleman. He was a corporal in the 43rd Wisconsin. What was so amazing is that he left a number of sketches. I feel the same way sometimes. Most days, actually. But he left a number of sketches in these letters, and in one of those letters, he actually sketched the interior of what Johnsonville looked like. To this moment, nobody had any idea. There had never been any letter, no photograph, anything that showed what the interior looked like, other than those 5 photos. We did not know about the soldier barracks there. And when I was manager, we uncovered a lot of those foundations. We would be out there on a daily basis, and knapsack buckles and buttons and pieces of everything every time it rained, would just come up out of the ground. So we got state archaeology involved, and they were able to uncover one of the foundations of those barrack buildings. So as the Confederates are moving on Johnsonville, there's a series of engagements that continue. One of those is called the Battle of Reynoldsburg Island. The 2 boats, USS Key West and Tarawa, get word through telegraph that Forrest has captured these boats, and they're en route somewhere on the Tennessee River between Paris Landing and Johnsonville. So King, the naval commandant, he gets in his flagship in the Tarawa, and they go looking for this boat. They intercept the captured Undine and the Venus. Remember, the Undine is the gunboat, the Venus is the civilian transport boat. They're all loaded down with Confederate soldiers. They actually come around the bend, if you know the Tennessee River, at Davidson's Ferry. If you know where Davidson's Ferry is, it's a very historic area. The Confederates actually camped there that night. There's been a lot of artifacts found right there too. There's a lot of artifacts all up and down there. But anyway, forces Confederates after they open fire. There's a very heated battle that takes place, and that becomes known as the Battle of Reynoldsburg Island. This is straight out of the ORs. I think it's a fantastic sketch, but this shows Reynoldsburg Island right here. This is Humphreys County, by the way. Johnsonville is right here. But the Federal flotilla is still coming down. They get to Reynoldsburg Island. Now, all the old salts, as they call them, the old riverine captains and vessel drivers, they knew about the Reynoldsburg Island. It was a shoaled island. So if you know about the Muscle Shoals, this island pushed the Tennessee River to the right, where it only drew about 15 feet of water. It became known on the Tennessee River as the Chute. And you could only, think of a 170 to 200 ton vessel trying to get through the Chute. So it's going to be very narrow, and they can only go one boat at a time. Well, the Confederates, knowing this, they concealed themselves in 5 different batteries inside of the Chute, and just, as I mentioned earlier, just really give a shellacking to these Federal boats as they try to come through. Leroy Fitch, after the 3rd boat, realizes they can't get through, so he comes back to the foot of the island right here. Eventually, he falls back out of the protection of all of it. He falls back to 40 miles, 25 miles from that point, to Paris Landing. Later, he goes under a court-martial hearing because of that act, why he didn't go down to try to help King later in the battle. And there's a lot of little mini stories, like most Civil War history is. This is as all of us, we've been Civil War historians our whole life, and I've looked at the pictorial history of the Civil War 1,000 times, and I'm scrolling through there one Christmas, and I found this photo that I probably looked at 100 times, and I got my magnifying glass out, and that boat right there says number 32. That's the USS Key West. That's King's flagship. This is taken at Mound City, Illinois. So that gives us a lot of provenance about where these boats may have been located. We do know that they were operating between Mound City and Johnsonville. So the photo said Mound City, Illinois. I don't know, but that's somewhere either on the Mississippi or the Tennessee River. That gives you an idea of what those boats look like on the water. You can see an ironclad behind it. Look at the difference between the ironclad and I'm unfortunately, I don't know, it probably would be the Carondelet possibly, or the Cincinnati. But look at this, look at the sheer size, the difference between these boats. So this is what's fighting at Reynoldsburg Island right now. That's what's trying to get through the Chute. So the Tarawa, after receiving, the Tarawa's with the Key West. They're trying to recapture these boats. Big firefights going on. The Venus is actually captured during the fight. The Tarawa hooks a tow rope to it and pulls it back to Johnsonville for repairs. While all this is going on, the Confederates are still they still have the Undine. They retreat back to the vicinity of Reynoldsburg Island, and they wait there overnight. In the meantime, Forrest's troops continue down all the way. They get to Eva, Tennessee. If you know where Nathan Bedford Forrest State Park is, that's Eva. Directly in that vicinity, they begin building gun emplacements on the night of November the 3rd, in some of the worst rainfall that I've ever read about. So in all these muddy locations, the Confederates construct 5 positions across 1 mile of terrain in front of this depot, that picture that I showed you earlier. On the morning of November 4th, which is the date of the Battle of Johnsonville, one other thing I was able to uncover is there's a second battle of Reynoldsburg Island. So these Federal gunboats go back up to try to intercept the Undine, and this is when the Undine gives up. They're overpowered. The Confederates escape the boat, and they set her afire, and that's been some mystery. Some of you may have followed the actions of the Raise the Gunboat folks that kind of came together back in the late 80s, 1990s. when I was manager there, that group was almost dissolved, but they've been looking for this Undine for years. They found what they thought was a Civil War wreck, but it turned out being a 1910 era barge. But somewhere right below the foot of Pilot Knob, which is where Nathan Bedford Forest State Park is located, the Undine was fired somewhere was burned on the side of the beach. We know this because we got direct accounts of the Confederates saying that we took coal oil lamps, we doused ticking, and the tickings in those days were filled with cedar shavings, and they threw these tickings inside the boat, and they said they watched it set afire. So we do have a direct account saying that they burned the boat. So the Confederates abandoned, they burn it, and then they're forced to give up due to the relentless fire also from the Key West. At the end of this battle, when the Key West got back to Johnsonville, it had over 19 direct cannonball holes in its side. So quite a firefight. I'll compare that any day to the gunboat battle at Fort Donelson, which was pretty fierce, but those gunboats stayed in line, basically being in fire directly with the Confederates at that time. This was two separate naval battles with a lot of armament engaged. There was quite a bit of munitions that were exchanged there. Confederate artillery, you can see what they had. They had 4 3-inch Rodmans, 4 12-pound howitzers, 2 pretty rare at that time 14-pounder James rifles, and 2 10-pound Parrott rifles. They were strategically placed in these 5 positions on the evening of November the 3rd through the 4th. This is where Morton finds Forrest sitting under, he's sick. Apparently, the multiple accounts is that he was sitting under a tree draped with a poncho. He also has a conversation at that time that he tells Morton that he thought this was a bad idea. And you got to remember, they built these gun chambers in the natural levee of the Tennessee River. And, before it was flooded, a natural levee is, you can look across the Tennessee River here at Pittsburgh Landing and see, I know it's rip-wrapped now, but you can see there's a little bit of a natural levee that's still left. What they did is they concealed themselves in the heavy foliage that's on that side of the river, and they began cutting these gun embrasures in this natural levee and pushing their guns up, totally concealed. One of the biggest mysteries about this entire campaign, and I still try to wrap my head around, is how the Federals that were 300 yards away never heard 3,000 troopers moving in mud. You would hear horse trace chains rattling. You would hear, wooden caissons. You guys think you would hear a 3,000-man army moving 300 yards across the river? Now, I know it's raining. You might get the shimmy from the sunlight of something that, a bayonet or something. But apparently the Federals, later on, they said that they didn't know about it. Later on in some of the accounts, they said that we knew they were there the whole time. So who knows? So the Confederate preparations, as I mentioned, they work all through the night. Chalmers and Buford's division, with about 3,000 Confederates, camouflage themselves in gun positions in the heavy foliage. So not only do you have these artillery pieces, you've got the Confederates that have concealed themselves as snipers, as infantry, and they've kind of pickled themselves in amongst all this foliage. So they're ready for battle. Forrest eventually gives his officers the command to synchronize their watches that at 2:00 p.m. we would start the battle. So through Sergeant Zaring's guns, Sergeant Zaring would fire under Morton's battery the first round. Upon the first firing, the whole front would open up. And when it did, it became a hellacious engagement. So at 2 p.m. on November the 4th, this is another artist's depiction. I think it was probably a little more camouflage than that. But you can kind of see maybe what that would have looked like. I'm sorry we don't have the time, but there's some other accounts of the Union vessels sailing right along the bank, and Morton claims in his account, he says, the Federal boat came so close to the bank that I could have thrown a penny onto this deck. So they're sitting there, in the camouflage, and these boats are just plying along the riverbank looking for Confederates. He says they came so close, he says I could have tossed a penny onto it. That's a pretty good account, I think. So the Federal artillery from inside the fort, they immediately respond. These gunners are the famed 1st Kansas Battery and also United States Colored Troops batteries. Shells just erupt from both sides. Also, when the battle starts, the gunboats that are docked there, except for the Undine that's been destroyed, they back out into the water and enfilade the Confederates. This is what Forrest tells Morton directly he did not want to happen, because if they were to get caught in those river bottoms by this seacoast artillery who had 50 guns combined between those vessels and the forts, they could have very easily their command been destroyed in the bottoms of those creeks down there in the Tennessee River bottoms. So they were very fortunate that did not happen, because the Federal shells from the fort basically overall are ineffective. That's also one of the reasons why today Johnsonville, Tennessee, has some of the largest dug shells by artifact collectors in most areas that I know in Tennessee. I know 2 friends of mine are relic hunters that have hunted that area quite a bit. Most of those shells overshot. The town eventually became New Johnsonville. Johnsonville was flooded because of the Tennessee River flood that formed the Kentucky Reservoir, and they moved the town up on the hill. So the hill that's now DuPont that goes down to the park was catching the embedding of these overfired shells, and they were just embedding themselves in this hillside. And then through 160 years of erosion, a lot of that stuff was washed down to the edge of the riverbank. So, when I was manager there, DuPont was about 2 miles up the river. That stretch between DuPont and the depot, you still walk that today. You find a lot of stuff down through there. There's a picture of the fort. That's one of Coonley's photographs. It's still there today. That's the lower redoubt. You can see some of the unlimbered guns of the 1st Kansas Battery. These are all administrative buildings. I counted every one of these buildings because I wanted to know. Enlarged them, thank goodness for digital photography. I came up with somewhere between 190 to 200 buildings. So pure chaos happens from these positions. They take out warehouse number 1, that single roof warehouse. They basically hit all the supplies all the stores of supplies that are scattered out all over this wharf. In the middle of this, and this is where the biggest confusion takes place, the federal commander, Thompson, loses his nerve, and he tells Henry Howland, who's the chief assistant quartermaster at Johnsonville, to get a number of men together with torches and go on board these vessels and start setting them afire. I can't imagine this. Once again, in Morton's account, he says that we couldn't believe our eyes. The Federals were walking upon these beautiful vessels, and they started setting fire to them themselves, for fearing that he apparently thought that Forrest had somehow forded the Tennessee River and was going to come around and take Johnsonville from the rear. Keep in mind, every single thing on the mind of a field officer in charge of a secluded depot or defensive work, especially at that time in Tennessee, one thing was on their mind, and that was Fort Pillow. And one of the reasons that is because he was primarily in charge of black troops at Johnsonville as well. So everything that had dominated the newspapers, and if you dig through the archives, you can see basically from April of 1864 all the way up until November, there's some mentioning of Fort Pillow. So that obviously is probably on the mind of Thompson. That never was the plan of Forrest. They'd always planned to engage the Federals strictly across the river, which is why there's very few casualties of the Battle of Johnsonville, because unlike Shiloh, where you got men just face to face in the woods fighting over open terrain, here they're fighting over a 300-yard watery battlefield. Anyway, the Federals set fire to their transports, and these things become aflame. The Confederates eventually withdraw. They fight until the evening. They withdraw to Perryville that night. Forrest remains on the field with Rucker's brigade and another battery. And another battle resumes the next morning. A very furious fight breaks out on the 5th. These black troops run to the edge of the water. There's small arms fire that takes place between Rutgers Brigade and these men. While that's going on, the artillery that's left behind, bridge section that's assigned to Rutgers Brigade, which was part of Rice's battery, began really just shelling the town. So there's a lot of artillery that's fired all day long. And this resumes about 9 o'clock, artillery fire at 1 hour intervals for the remainder of the day until nightfall. So with most of the federal depots destroyed, forced, satisfied, he retreats, he withdraws from Johnsonville that night, and he claims under the inferno, under the firelight of the burning wharf on the burning buildings at the wharf at Johnsonville, where he could see the sky illuminated for 6 miles. So as he's retreating to Perryville, apparently, there was such a inferno that had been caused by the burning of the federal transport boats by their own people. That's the basic conclusion of the Battle of Johnsonville. Now, when I put that picture in there, so if you go there today, this is the park. Right here, in about 15 feet of water, sits the USS Elphin that's destroyed in the battle, and the Tarawa is somewhere right here. And then there's some barges on down this direction. This is the position of the single roofed warehouse number 1. In 2010, when I was manager there, we had state archaeologists through a grant dive on those boats, and a lot of the artifacts they recovered are in our museum today. Most of those are from the Tarawa. We do know that the tops of all those boats have been dredged off. Found records in 1910 and 1912. The Corps of Engineers dredged the river, deep in the channel. When they did, the dredge machines took off the tops of those boats. So what's there today are from the deck below, and the divers were able to cut holes into those decks and retrieve some of those artifacts. But that's just some of the naval archaeology that's still in place right here on our own Tennessee River. So the federal losses, tremendous amount: 4 gunboats, 14 transports, 17 barges, 33 pieces of artillery. The quartermaster stores burned 75,000 to 120,000 tons of supplies, 9,000 shoes and blankets. I'm still trying to get, this is directly out of the ORs, by the way. I'm still trying to get my head around the 150 Union prisoners, unless those were some of the sailors that they captured on some of these boats at Paris Landing. Total estimated loss, $6,700,000, which in today's equivalency would be over about probably close to $1 billion in damages. Confederate losses, 2 men killed. One of those men was killed by a limb that was hit by one of these flying Federal shells. It broke the limb. It fell over the gun and it broke his neck. The other one was, we don't know. 9 men wounded. So you can see the Confederate losses were very low. Now, as a result of this, Thompson telegraphs, he wires Thomas in Nashville saying that we're being attacked, we need help. So he sends, and this is why I always have Johnsonville as a tie to the Battle of Franklin. Y'all know Schofield as being right in the apex at the Carter House, right on the Franklin Pike. Well, before he gets there, before he gets to Spring Hill, Thomas gives him orders to come to Nashville, get on the National Northwestern Railroad, and go take 2 brigades and reinforce Johnsonville. So just days before the Battle of Franklin, and he ends up back at Spring Hill, he's at Johnsonville. So Schofield shows up at Johnsonville with these 2 brigades under Crozier and Moore. Oh, and by the way, that's the upper redoubt today. So when you go to Johnsonville, as I mentioned, some of the most beautifully preserved earthworks you've ever seen. There you go. That's the upper redoubt. And I put that there because Schofield, when they showed up, they started reinforcing the earthworks. They started adding dirt to these forts. Apparently they really built this up. They cut all the trees on the riverfront. They went across the river. They felled all of those trees, so they had a clear field of fire. So on the 26th of November, Thomas orders Johnsonville completely abandoned with all of the stores. on the 30th, which is the bloody Battle of Franklin, same day. The final train of stores and supplies leaves Johnsonville en route to Nashville. So all the stores and everything that they put into Johnsonville ends up back at the Nashville depot. Now, the results, Johnsonville is a tactical victory for the Confederates. Strategically, Force's victory has very little effect against Sherman's massive Union war machine at that time that's moving rapidly through Georgia. The Johnsonville depot is almost completely destroyed on November 4th and 5th. Estimated losses to the Federals, you see as I showed you earlier, was $6,700,000. The aftermath of the Confederates' 2-week-long campaign not only resulted in the near complete destruction of Johnsonville, but also rendered the National Northwestern Railroad useless. This was another $1 billion railroad that was spent, kind of like Howard Hughes' airplanes that were never delivered. The loss of Johnsonville's supply base left General Thomas in Nashville doubtful of its use as a Tennessee River supply base. So, as I conclude tonight, Sherman's response to the people of Georgia after the loss of Johnsonville, as the general quoted, Sherman said, "As the rebels have destroyed our basic supplies, they," meaning the rebel citizens of Georgia, "must furnish our subsistence. You will bear the brunt of its after effects." What do you think he's talking about? His march that he conducts for Georgia eventually. So it can be argued that Sherman is so angered by these actions, and this isn't the first time. Forrest had been really on his rear peripheral through most of the war, tearing up railroads, destroying supplies. He was so angered, apparently, over this act, as John Marsalek mentions in his great book on Sherman, that he makes that quote. And this is tied to probably the most famous quote that you all heard, "That Devil Forrest," which became a title of one of his biography books. Well, there's a continuation of that quote. It's "That Devil Forrest," was down around Johnsonville again, wreaking havoc on the GD gunboats. End of quote. And that was Sherman's response to all of this. So Sherman's the one that coined that term, "That Devil Forrest," and he's referring to all of this destruction that takes place once again on his supply base in the rear. And with that, there's the book. I'm sorry I'm on duty with the state, so I can't sell you a book tonight, but you can buy it on Amazon. You can probably get some used copies on there too. If I see you all again, or you want to mail it to me, or you come up to Paris Landing, I'll be glad to sign it for you. Mr. McCalla, that's the end of my presentation. I'll be glad to take any questions anybody might have. I also have, I'll just run through these real quick if you want to see it. Jacob Coonley, who is the protege to George Bernard, who took all the Western Theater photographs that you've seen of Atlanta and Nashville. He was assigned to go to Johnsonville to take these photographs. So what I'm about to show you are the 5 known photographs of Johnsonville during the Civil War. There's number 1, and that's what it looks like today. There's number 2, which is my favorite because it shows the actual town of Johnsonville in the back. This is the civilian town. Well, don't we wish Shiloh would have just had one of these photographs? Here's the central part of the depot. You can see the trees are all charred. They're all burned from the fires. When you look at these in digital format very closely, you can see all the charring that's gone on. You can see all the destruction. What's amazing about this is that these little black dots right here are Union brogans. They're shoes that are scattered all over the railroad tracks. That's what that area looks like today. Number 3, there's the double-roofed warehouse that's set directly on the Tennessee River. By the way, these are just piles and piles of wheelbarrows. And as you look back into here, you can't see it on this, but when you enlarge that, there's just stacks and stacks of Federal blankets. This is some of the guns from Porter's Battery that helped us out with a lot of living history, but here's the river channel out here. From the edge of this to right here is only about 2 feet deep. You can wade out there. I wouldn't recommend it because there's a lot of stuff, but it's very shallow. But right in this area is where that warehouse sat. And there's the channel. That little island right there is what's remaining of the western riverbank as it would have existed in the Civil War. So you can see actually how close they would have been. Number 4 shows the entire scape of Johnsonville. And when you enlarge that, you see this building right here is a sawmill. You can see a man standing right there as if he's receiving a board coming out of the saw. So we do know that they produced over 400,000 square board feet of lumber during their 7-month existence here, which was used to build all of these support buildings. Up on top of the hill, you see the felled trees, and you see the earthen fort known as Fort Johnson, which still stands today. There's what it looks like today. Still up there on top of the hill. Here's the earthen walls that go around it. We did quite a bit of work when I was there restoring that. Most of those trees were taken down like what happened here with the windstorms and the tornadoes. And then probably the most famous photo that ended up being the dust jacket of my book is the unlimbered guns of the United States, 2nd United States Colored Light Artillery. This is a great photograph right here. You see a McClellan saddle sitting right here. You see the train cars sitting down here, which tells us there was another peripheral railroad track that went out in this direction. You see a huge stockaded horse corral in the back. That's that 6-acre corral. Here's the Tennessee River. Here's Trace Creek right here as it rolls into the river. This is that central dock as it comes into the terminus. And all of these men are black soldiers in overcoats. And aside the 2 photographs from the Bernard collection from the Nashville pictures that show the Western Theater men in overcoats, this is one of the only known photographs that show black soldiers in overcoats in the Western Theater. And there's what it looks like today. We were burning a debris pile down there, opening this up. That's Pilot Knob right here. The Undine would have been burned somewhere right over here. This is an aerial photo taken in 1937 by TVA prior to, they went along, as y'all probably read, before they flooded the Tennessee Valley and took aerial photographs. This is one from 1937 that shows the Johnsonville depot from the air. I think it's just fantastic. But what's important, you still see Civil War era buildings intact. There's a federal barracks building right there that later became a hotel. Here's another one. Here's all of these buildings that I showed you in that last photograph where I said was the civilian town. Here's the northern spur of the railroad. Here's the terminus. Eventually in 1867, the Tennessee River was bridged at one place, and it was at Johnsonville. And that's the bridge right here. And then here's the southern spur as it goes this way. But I just, all of this today up to here is underwater. But all the, this right here, I believe, is the outline of the upper fort. And then post-Civil War, there's the bridge. So when the bridge came in 1867, this was in that photo that I showed you earlier, Lucas Landing being right here. I said that was a Civil War era building, and I said if you look to the left, you would see the guts of a sunken gunboat. That's one of the boats that are still there today. That's either the Elfin or the Tarwa. This is below the decks. You can still see, this is 1914. When they did the dive in this general vicinity, they were able to find this wall of the boat. This is all gone. And then when I showed you that photograph earlier, I said that's what's left of the western riverbank. These piers, the last one, which is this one, is the one that's still there in that photograph. And then there's the Parker Hotel, which is this building. And if you're familiar with the Bonnie and Clyde story, Bonnie Parker had relatives from Houston, Texas that lived in Tennessee. The relatives, those Tennessee relatives, were the Parkers of Tennessee that ran and operated this hotel. We never found any evidence, nor did I talk. I actually talked to one of the historians that did some work on the Bonnie and Clyde story about her Tennessee connection. We do know that this was the family, but we do not know if Bonnie and Clyde actually ever stayed here on their whereabouts, excursions. And the last photograph ever taken of Johnsonville prior to the flood, you can see the TVA man here with what looks like a measuring clipboard. There's the post-Civil War railroad depot. You can still see the federal barracks that still exist right there in 1937. And then as you left Johnsonville before you went across the bridge, there's the bridge. And, well, I take that back. There's one other photograph after that. This is the 1937 flood, the famous 1937 flood that submerged Paducah and all the Ohio River Valley. One more aerial photograph that shows the federal depot. There's the spur is still intact. There's the remnants of that building where I showed you Lucas Landing earlier. And that's the last photo. It was taken in 1940. In 1940, there were still 30 residents living in Johnsonville, but like most poor southern towns, the Depression hit Johnsonville very, very hard. So we do know from the census in 1944, when they flooded the valley, there were 30 people that were still living in amongst Johnsonville. And that's it. When you go there today, that's what you get to see. So with that, I'll open the floor up for any questions.
Only 8 people